Hello friends, welcome back. We're on lesson 4 now, our final lesson in this project of our window pane drawing in the style of Tiffany, Lewis Comfort Tiffany. Now hopefully you've had a chance to view lessons 1, 2, and 3 in sequence before joining me for lesson 4. And I'm so excited that we're nearing the end of this project. And we're going to review now what you need as we finish up our window pane drawing. So you need some scrap paper. Of course, your drawing where you are so far, the markers that you used for your color, and a nice thick black marker. Lewis Comfort Tiffany was one of the premier artists of the Art Nouveau movement. We talked about that in one of the prior lessons. And one of the great hallmarks of that movement was that art was brought out of the museums into everyday homes. Now granted, stained glass windows were rather pricey, so it was probably more luxurious homes, but the whole idea of using the decorative arts in textiles and in furniture and in wall decorations and windows, that came into vogue with the Art Nouveau movement, which was at the very turn of the century of the last century. In fact, one of the windows we looked at last lesson was made in 1902. So he started making windows about 1880 and continued to the end of his life when he was well into his 80s. Pretty amazing guy. Okay, so what are we doing now? We're doing a drawing with magic marker. We're certainly not working in glass, but we're using a lot of the same principles that Tiffany used in making that. We're focusing on shape. Very clearly looking at the shape. He had to make glass pieces in those shapes. We're doing it with line, with pencil and then marker. We're using nature as our subject matter, which was often a subject matter for Tiffany. And we're balancing our composition by not only having a subject matter as the focus, but also breaking up the negative space. We're very careful about our composition, where we place our object on the picture plane. Tiffany was very aware of that. He wanted to make a very pleasing design that was the sum of all of those parts, the little pieces of glass. And we're using thick black lines. We're using marker. He used lead as part of the overall design. Now let's talk a little bit more about the stained glass process. See, artisans of that time would first make a drawing that was their design. And that kind of drawing that acted as the blueprint for the glass artist was called a cartoon. Now, not the cartoon like you would watch on Saturday morning. This was a flat drawing that had every line in it that was going to be used for the lead. And it was the exact size of what the final window would be. And that cartoon would be laid on the table, and the craftsman would then cut pieces of glass to fit every part in the drawing, kind of like a puzzle. And they used that cartoon as their guide. And then when the time came to put all of those pieces of glass together, the craftsman would grab lead cames. That's a strange word. C-A-M-E-S, cames. And that's the long putty made of lead. It was on a large coil, and the craftsman would lay it in between the pieces of glass, and that's what the glass would be stuck into to hold it together. So lead was very pliable but very heavy. And so the window was very heavy, and that meant it had to be very strong and rigid so it would stay in the window frame and not fall apart. So that's why there's a lot of lead cames throughout Tiffany's pieces. They were large windows. Now it wasn't enough to just leave the lead cames as they were. It was too soft. So then the craftsman would take a torch and they would solder the ends of the cames. Solder is where the flame actually melts it but then makes it harder and firm. And that's how the process went. Well, it was quite a long process and you needed to be very skilled to do it. And that's one of the reasons that stained glass windows are so expensive. Now, of course, we're not using lead cames. What we're going to be using is a thick black line. But it's a little challenging to get that thick black line consistent throughout the whole drawing. But it does add a special design element. Let's go back and look at one of Tiffany's best windows, which we've looked at before, which is Parakeets and Goldfish Bowl. You'll see the thick black lines that divide this window into fourths. You'll also see all of the black lines that outline every single shape, even the smallest shapes. Now, those lines are not quite as thick as these big guidelines, but they're consistent lines around all of these shapes. And that's the trick for us when we're using marker, is to have those thick lines be consistent as we're drawing. It's also an important design element that really makes this look like a window and not like any other type of drawing. Now you should have done all of your color, but you might need to do some touch-up. What does that mean? It's when you step back and you look at it, you say, there's a little bit of white showing. That's why you want to keep the same markers handy that you used. And wherever you see a little bit of white showing, go in with the very tip of the marker and very, very lightly just brush over so you can make the color more solid. Now I'm not really worried about where one color meets another color, like where this leaf meets this shape, because we're going to be using our thick black marker to simulate the lead cames that are in a stained glass window, and that white will be covered. I'm talking about white that shows up within a shape that you've colored in. So take some time and just do your touch-up very lightly. Now you can always go back once you've used the black, but let me give you a little tip about markers. Black, of course, is the very darkest color. And so you always use the very darkest colors last. Of course, our black will be last. Use your lighter colors first. And the reason is because things like a marker can be wet and you could smudge over your lighter colors. It's very difficult to go back and make it lighter. So you can't really color in when you've already used black, especially when wet comes against wet. So that's why we get all the colors done first. And the last thing we do is the black thick line that are the lead cames, rather than like a coloring book where you have the black lines first and then you put in the color. We're doing the opposite. Okay, so I've done some touch-up and I think I'm happy with where my touch-up is taking place. And I want to start using my thick black marker. Remember I talked about the lead cames? That's the long coil of Play-Doh-like material that was made of lead. It was very soft and pliable, but it was very heavy. And that's what the craftsman would use to put the pieces of glass together. And they would lay it out on the cartoon. And that would be their pattern. Well, we're going to do our dark black lines now, and we're going to very specifically work in one direction. I'm right-handed, which means I'm going to start to my left and move to my right. If you're left-handed, you're going to start on the right and move to your left. And the reason is because black marker is wet and so black, I don't want to smudge across my good drawing as I work all over. So you don't want to work in a random pattern. You want to definitely work from one side to the other. And the drawing will always be under my arm so that I'm working on an edge. Okay, so how do we get started? I think the best place to start is our stems. Those are longer, straighter lines. And what I want you to do for these is to first check out the point of your thick black marker. It's a chisel tip like mine. Then just like with our colored markers, we know, and I can experiment on my scrap paper, I can get a thick line by holding it that way. And if I turn it slightly, my line is thinner. Now, it's not a thin line like a pen line, but you can see I have two different widths. So I'm going to use the thinner of the thick lines to be all around my flowers and stem. We'll use the very thick line when we do between the shapes. So to start, I want to go around all of these little petals. And I want to use my marker over my pencil lines. And you're saying, but Miss Pat, I might not be able to see my pencil lines anymore. Well, that's okay, because this is already starting to represent the flowers without the pencil lines, so you're fine. So if I start with the stem, anywhere where a color meets another color is going to get a black line. Here I'm outlining the leaf. And here is my flower, and I want to make sure I show petals, so I'm doing oval shapes in black, and it might not be exactly what I had drawn. but they're all a little bit different size and shape right over the purple and pink combination. Like that. Now there's also a vein in the center of this leaf. Even though it's all one color, green, I'm going to use that line to show detail. Take a look at one of the Tiffany windows that we've looked at before. Cap my marker to keep it nice and moist. This is parakeets and goldfish bowl. And you'll notice that Tiffany used the black lead cane lines to show detail. Every feather is delineated between each little petal of the magnolia blossoms. And so even though it's all one bird and it might be one color, he uses the black lines to show detail because the smaller the shape in glass, the finer the detail he could achieve on his windows. So we're going to do the same thing. In our leaves, we're going to put a line for the vein, all one color, it's one shape, but we're going to try and get a level of detail. Now remember I said we're going to work from left to right, but now I'm ready to do a shape, so I want to make sure I have the widest possible edge on my marker and do a nice thick black line where my shapes touch each other. I'm not going really slow. You can go slow as long as you're really careful, but I find if I pick up the speed a little bit, my hand doesn't shake as much. So again, friends, practice. Try and outline a leaf on your scrap paper and see if you do better going very slow or do you better going fast. Here's another leaf. Outline and the vein in the center. Now that line looks too thin compared to the one near it. I want to keep my lead cane lines of my shapes nice and thick. So I'm going to turn my marker so I can get a really thick line. And I'm working left to right because I'm right-handed. Can you already see how those shapes pop out against the black line? You know, it took a long time to make stained glass windows. Every time they coiled up some lead, they had to spend a lot of time carefully piecing over the cartoon each piece of glass. And the more intricate the design, the longer it took to complete the window. And of course, Tiffany didn't just put a whole bunch of one color glass. He wanted every piece to have a uniqueness to it. When he experimented with a lot of metals and fumes to make the glass different colors, he wanted a sky to be not one shade of blue, but many shades of blue. He wanted the parakeet's wings to be not one shade of green, but many. And so he'd have a lot of variety in his glass. That meant a lot of little pieces soldered together with the lead canes. Sometimes several craftsmen would work on one window at a time. Someone would work on one end while someone else worked on the other. The issue was getting the window that was usually quite large, rigid enough and enough detail with all that lead where it wasn't so heavy it couldn't be installed well. Some of those windows in churches are very large. Can you imagine trying to set that into the wall? It weighed a lot. Well, thankfully, our drawing is just marker on board, and so it's nice and light, and you'll get to share it anywhere. Perhaps just hang it with a magnet on a refrigerator. Now you want your lines to be nice and black. Sometimes, friends, you might have noticed that a black marker starts to look gray after a while. That means it's starting to dry out. If that happens, simply cap your marker, do something else for a little bit, turn your marker upside down and let it stay on the table. Don't stand it up. Let's try and get the ink towards the tip. Come back and in a little while, your tip is nice and moist again and will be a nice black line. Now I'm going right over where there was already color. These skinny stems, it's going to be hard to see the green in between, but don't worry about it. Just go right over where your original pencil line was, or where you think your original pencil line was, and it will look right. Remember I talked about marker puddle? That's when you hold a marker in one spot too long. That same thing can happen with the black marker, so be very careful. I know you might be concentrating and thinking, but don't hold your marker on the paper until you know exactly what you're going to do, so you don't have marker puddle. I want a thicker line there, so let me turn my marker and get a thicker line. There we go. Now here's another bloom, so I'm going to do some smaller shapes in black. Kind of oval, upturned shapes. I'm going to move to a different black marker now because I want to make sure my lines are nice and black. I can't see my pencil lines. I'm not worried about it, friends. I have enough color there. I'm just delineating some petal type shapes and suggesting what those petals look like. So we're about halfway done with our black lines. Once you get really comfortable with how your marker works and how you hold it, you're probably going to start to go a little bit quicker, which is great. But don't feel like you have to rush. Take your time to get it just right. My friends who are a little bit younger, it might be a little more difficult to get the lines exactly straight the way you want. You're developing your fine motor skills. If you have an older friend or brother and sister nearby, they might be able to go a little faster because their muscles in their hands are more developed. That's okay. You take the time you need to get the drawing just right. I'm at my last bloom. I'm going to make some oval shapes that overlap each other to represent the petals. I'm varying kind of their direction and their size and what the edges look like. I just have a few more shapes to do and we're done the interior shapes. I'm going off the edge, but I'm protecting my surface with scrap paper. Now I see I forgot a vein here. I'm going to go back in. I'm going to carefully look. Ah, I see I missed a vein connection right there and right here. Now I want to look and see if my cane lines are all about the same width. I think some are a little thinner, so I'm going to go back. Because in order to really look like a stained glass window, which had the lead coil that was all from the same coil, in terms of these big pieces, I want to make sure they all look kind of the same. We're not finished yet, friends. Okay, all of the interior shapes where one shape meets another or where one color meets another, it looks like they're done. But we have one more step. And this is actually a pretty nerve-wracking step, I think. It's the framing. And it's a little harder to do, so let me walk you through it. We want to get a nice solid black line all the way around the outer edge of the entire drawing. Now, how do we do that? Well, the technique we're going to use is half on, half off. The marker tip is going to be half on the paper, our final drawing, and half on the scrap paper. This is where it's really important that you make sure you have a piece of scrap paper underneath. And we're going to actually drag the marker in one stroke all the way down. And this is where I think going a little bit faster actually helps to keep your hand from being shaky. Now I know you're worried. What if my marker slips? What if I go into some part of my drawing? It'll be ruined. Well, no, it won't, friends. There's some random lead lines in a lot of Tiffany's windows. And when I say random, what I mean is they look like they aren't supposed to be there, but they all added to the design. Look at our friends here on parakeet and goldfish. There's some thinner lines you'll notice that come in here, whereas there's thick lines and some thin lines. And there seem to be just kind of random lines that don't connect to anything. If that happens to you where your marker slips and a random black line is in, just make a new shape. It'll totally work. So I want you to watch me first, and then I want you to try and do your framing of your piece of art. So because I'm right-handed, I'm going to start on the left side, and then I will turn my drawing all 4 times, like this, so that I'm always doing the same stroke in the same direction, and I turn my art. So let me start with the shorter side. What I'm going to do is make my point of my marker half on, half off. I'm going to practice first up here. I can see how thick my line can be. And I'm going to place my marker there and drag it all the way down. Okay? So I'm off my page and half my marker is on my page. See that? This is on the scrap. This is the edge that's on the frame. Let me do one more. See, I turn my drawing rather than try and do it at a weird angle. I'm always going to do it the same way. I'm going to make sure my marker tip, because this is a broad marker, is half on, half off. I'm going to start outside the picture frame because I don't want marker puddle. And then I'm just going to drag down like that. I don't want you to be anxious about this, my friends. Sometimes we have to do things that make us a little nervous or anxious. But you know, there's a great verse in the Bible that tells us to not be anxious about it. In fact, it's my favorite verse, and it's found in Philippians 4. Let me read it to you. It's Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. That's a great verse. What it tells us is we don't have to worry about things, but we should be praying about it. So you know what? Let's just say a prayer right now about finishing up this piece of art. God, we just pray that you be with us. Give us steady hands. Help us to concentrate and focus. We want to do well. We want to make an excellent drawing because you're the God of excellence and you deserve it. So thank you, God, for this time we have to do this lesson, to finish up our Tiffany window, and we pray you'd be with us as we do this last step. See, that's all it takes. Now that doesn't mean that everything is going to turn out perfectly, but what it does mean is that you are turning that over to God and you're not going to worry about it anymore. So now I've done 2 sides. I'm going to turn my paper, but I want you to try it too. Get your final drawing ready. Make sure you're on top of some scrap paper and lay your marker half on, half off that edge. And drag the marker in a nice fluid motion all the way down. And go off the edge. And there's my black frame. And I have one more side to do. And then our Tiffany window is finished. Half on, half off. Drag my marker all the way down. There. So that was the last line. And we finished our Tiffany window. The interesting thing is, in Bible times, windows had no glass. Do you remember all the stories you hear about windows in the Bible, like Rahab and the scarlet cord? Or when the man falls asleep while Paul is preaching and falls right out of the window? Well, there's no mention of glass. In fact, they don't look through a window, they look out a window. The Romans were the first to use glass in the first century, but those were for only the very high echelon of society, the emperor, and it was very rare. And of course, in the 1100s, stained glass was used in churches. In fact, there's gorgeous stained glass windows in a lot of churches, but those windows with the glass were to prevent flies from coming in when all the people would congregate in that church or cathedral. The first modern use of glass in the everyday home wasn't until the 17th century. Well, Tiffany traveled and saw lots of stained glass, and none are as beautiful as one of my favorites that he did, called the Sermon on the Mount. Louis Comfort Tiffany made church windows with lots of scenes from the Bible. This is a memorial window. Someone in the church had paid to have this window made in honor of their loved one. This is Matthew Luce, and this window was made in 1902. And it's a beautiful picture of Jesus standing at a tree delivering his Sermon on the Mount. How long do you think it took to make that window? And do you think Louis Comfort Tiffany, doing all of those beautiful windows of Bible stories, that he heard the good news? I sure hope so. Now, of course, a real Tiffany window took a lot of time to do with all that glass and all that lead. It took us about an hour and a half to complete our Tiffany window using just magic marker. But markers are a brilliant, fun tool to use, a lot of vibrant colors, so really experiment and play with magic markers whenever you can. Remember, don't use paper, use board so that it's sturdier and can absorb all that wet marker. I think it's a lot of fun to find out about artists like Louis Comfort Tiffany and the extraordinary things he did with art glass in the very beginning of the 20th century. So thanks so much for joining me for this project and these 4 lessons. If you're interested in finding out about Art Class 1, then check out our website at www.seethelightshine.com. I'm Pat Nepley, your master artist, signing off for this project, and I hope you'll join me again for Art Class 2.